Welcome everyone to Strait Science. Strait Science is an evening science seminar series put on by UAF Northwest Campus in Nome, and also UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks, UAF Alaska Sea Grant, also in Nome. And both UAF Northwest Campus and UAF Alaska Sea Grant, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region, and we will we serve everyone in the Bering Strait region best we can. And the Bering Strait region is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, Yupik, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. And tonight we have Robb Kaler. Robb Kaler, not a stranger to Strait Science. So we're welcome back, Robb. Robb is the Fish and Wildlife Services seabird specialist in Anchorage. And like I say, with all that we've been enduring and all the region's been enduring for the last several years, Robb's been a big, strong component of getting us analysis and getting us answers. So with that, tonight he's going to talk about seabirds and our changing northern Bering Sea ecosystem and how the birds are faring where we are. And just locally, I guess I wanted to say, for everyone that's local, we want to be on the lookout. We've already had our first report of a dead seabird, and that came out of the area near Shishmaref, and that was on the 26th of February. So a murre, adult murre, was on the snow, dead and freshly dead. And so we just are putting a shout out there to keep your eyes open, even though it is early. We seem to be having, of course, interesting ice conditions. With that, thank you so much, Robb Kaler, for being here. We really appreciate it, and take it away.
Hey, yes, thank you so much, Gay. That's always lovely to have a warm welcome like that. Rick Toman always gets a warm welcome like that, and I'm flattered. So anyways, thanks. So I'm based in Anchorage. A lot of the information I'm going to share, I'm going to be pulling from a slide stack that Kathy Kulitz had put together. Kathy is retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service last February, or rather, yeah, we're already in March, so a year ago February. And so I hopefully don't stumble too much over some of this, but Kathy and Liz Lubunsky are my co-authors for this presentation. And then as you can see on this slide, there's a lot of collaborators studying seabirds, and I like to refer to it mostly as marine birds, because we're interested in birds that are in the marine environment, whether they're near shore or offshore, but they are breeding on our Alaskan lands, but some of them, as I'll talk about, come up from Australia and New Zealand. So, and I don't know if can you see that, Gay? Are we good? I see that Jim Dory's still trying to get in.
Yes, we're good, and I'll try to deal with that waiting room. Maybe I'll get rid of it. And I got your slide up, and you're sounding great.
Okay, great. And then are there many people that have dialed in so that I know to describe describe the slides that I have for those that can't see them?
No callers yet.
Okay, great. So, all right. Yes, thanks everyone for joining. Let's see if I can actually move through these slides. Yes, Quiana. We work on the lands and waters of Inupiaq, the Yupik, both through the Bering Strait region, the Aleut, the Bering Sea, as well as Alaska. So Quiana to everybody, as well as our funders and partners. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, we have a huge amount of contributors, both financially or even just letting us on their ships, ships of opportunity. And from data analysts to funders, we are thankful for everybody's contributions. And the information I'll be sharing it's really not mine. Not my thunder to share, but I'm glad that I have an audience like this to share it with. So in Alaska, we have, for North America, we've got the lion's share of breeding seabirds for North America. 30 million seabirds, and I think you could even say 40 million seabirds. And those are just the ones that breed in Alaska. We also have another 30 to 40 million that come up to Alaskan waters during their austral winter. Those are the shearwaters, short-tailed and sooty shearwaters. And so we use seabirds as indicators of the marine environment. And so I often try to tell my leadership and then everybody else who will listen, like you, what are seabirds telling us? What are they really, why are they so valuable? Why is it so important to monitor and track seabird populations in Alaska? So in particular, we look at distribution and abundance because seabirds rely on prey, which could be anything from zooplankton, euphausids, up to the forage fish, herring, capelin. It's very valuable. And in terms of monitoring a fishery and the harvest of fisheries in Alaska, they're really a great indicator. Reproductive success, so that's when they're just breeding on they only come to shore 30% of their year, 3 months that they might be breeding, and but otherwise they spend the rest of their life at sea. And so prey and their diet is really something that we've learned about, but we mostly learn about what they're feeding their young. Knowing what they feed during the winter is another challenge. And that's where the kind of that survival, the winter conditions, and that's what we've learned a lot in the last 6 years, especially in the Bering Strait region, in terms of seabird die-offs. And I'll talk about that. So I think everybody in the Bering Strait region knows about the sea ice. At first it's paper thin. When it freezes, hopefully thickens over time, making ice a good proxy for the thickness. Arctic sea ice has survived for multiple summers historically, and can get to several meters thick. And its greatest thickness and increased volume is due to part of its low salt volume, the low salt content. And so that makes old sea ice survive through some of the summer melt seasons. Now, the diatoms, which are kind of growing underneath that, are responsible for a large part of the marine environment. They're really, and I was at the Pacific Seabird Group meeting 2 weeks ago and learned a lot that not all diatoms are created equal. Some are more fatty than others. And so that fatty acid, or the omega-3s, really increase, it's kind of like when your doctor tells you you should take fish oil or krill oil. That's really, so again, not all diatoms are created equal. And so these diatoms are really an important thing. And essentially those fatty acids are transferred up through the food web and really important for those higher trophic level, the salmon, marine birds, marine mammals. And so that's something that during these last couple of years, since 2018, with the lack of kind of an expansive or extensive sea ice layer, that has probably increased or decreased the amount of diatoms, or at least changed the food web. And so here in this image, and Gay, we still don't have anybody that I need to describe. Everybody can see my screen.
Yep,
Okay.
Everybody can see your screen.
Yeah, so in this figure here, you've got Atlantic, and the darker area you can see here, we are here, and then that circle is indicating the North Pacific. But the darker area, so both the Atlantic and the Pacific subarctic and Arctic seas, the seabird communities have changed with global climate change. Increasing viability in the north is restructuring seabird communities, even absent of the commercial fisheries that have been increasing with climate change. And given the environmental forecasts, the question is, can we predict which seabirds will predominate? And so an example of that is the alcids, which have reigned in the north. And alcids, these are our auks, or alcids, mers, and the auklets as well, have done very well in the north due to the cold water. with the strong fronts, the currents, and the concentration of an abundant prey. But the question is, going forward, how will they prevail into these new changing conditions of the rapidly warming ocean conditions? So we often, I guess not often, more recently, we start talking about what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, large scale currents. So this figure here from Seth Danielson at UAF, Alaska, University of Alaska Fairbanks, you see the gyre, the Gulf of Alaska gyre circling in the Gulf of Alaska region, the Beaufort gyre, but in general, you're seeing a lot of movement into the Arctic waters. So from the northern Bering to the Chukchi, and that's probably been increased due to a lack of sea ice extent over the last few years. So large-scale current systems in the North Pacific and the Pacific Arctic have been changing in the last decade very rapidly. And so in particular, the North Bering Sea, as I mentioned, what happens in the Bering Sea doesn't stay in the Bering Sea, and it's moving. And I think several presentations that Gay has hosted on Strait Science, Don Anderson from Woods Hole has talked about this movement of water more increasingly from the Bering into the Chukchi and into the Arctic. So seabird colonies are distributed throughout the Bering and Chukchi seas. The largest colonies by far are in the northern Bering, especially St. Lawrence and the Diomede Islands. The farthest north colonies, cliff nesting birds in the hundreds or thousands, are at Cape Lisburne, circled there in green. And so north of there, the colonies get smaller, less than 1,000 birds, and looser aggregations or groupings, and then become more ground nesting like terns and gulls. And so the Chukchi Sea itself, the Chukchi Seas host thousands of birds during the post-breeding season, which is August and October. And then the colonies circled in the green are monitored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Alaska Maritime, as well as some monitoring that's now recently been done at St. Lawrence Island with funding from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the World Wildlife Foundation. And so when sea ice is diminished, as it has been in the northern Bering and southern Chukchi, there are major ecological shifts that we're experiencing and seeing. Shown here in these twin diagrams, less extensive sea ice will lead to a lower deposition of sea ice and spring blooms of algae, that bottom figure, and a lower biomass of benthic communities. And so fish and zooplankton are anticipated to increase in importance to the pelagic feeding of whales such as orcas and humpbacks, and will become more important, which will become more important than sea ice associated bowhead and benthic feeding pinnipeds. So this figure here kind of indicating over the 20th century on the top right, 21st century with that increase in carbon dioxide. And so for seabirds, as I mentioned earlier, let me take a quick, as I indicated or mentioned earlier, seabirds are indicators of the marine ecosystem, the health of the marine ecosystem. Not that the marine ecosystem has health, but if it did, seabirds would be the tool for that. And so common prey items, Pacific sand lance and capelin, these are both cold water fishes. And then you've got juvenile walleye pollock. So it's lower quality prey, but have been increasing with warming sea temperatures. And then you've got juvenile Arctic cod on the far right there. High quality prey, but does not like warmer temperatures. And then the euphausiids are high quality, but they can be locally and seasonally abundant. And then the copepods and small zooplankton can vary in size and energy density. But this is primarily the food of seabirds, and that's why we monitor these seabirds, because this is also what some of our commercially harvested commercially harvested fish are also consuming. So for 4 decades. Kathy Kulitz-Lizabunski. Kathy, as I mentioned, is retired, but at sea surveys continue to be done. And an example is Laysan albatross. So they're breeding in the tropical Pacific, the Hawaiian Islands, and then come to our seas during their breeding season. And so you can see that they are moving. This is a heat map basically showing the upper left is 1971 to 1980, lower right 2001 to 2010. And you see a shift in their distribution over the last few decades, the last 4 decades. And then short-tailed shearwaters, which are omnivorous, meaning they're eating forage fish, but they're also eating euphausids, and they are progressing further to the north. So this is kind of a similar map for the short-tailed shearwaters, showing a heat map where they're increasing, and you see their fall. So the darker the color is, that's actually the increase in their density, or the number of birds that have been counted. So you see an indication of kind of a shifting ecosystem. So birds are coming north earlier to feed and moving further north as well. So, well, hopefully this will work. So this is based on data collected. So these are geolocators, 75 birds. And these 75 birds, the geolocators, this is a put on their leg, has to be collected later in the season or later in their life. And this is in partnership with Phillips Island. So Phillips Island Nature Reserve is on the south side of Australia. But again, short-tailed shearwaters, they come to our waters in Alaska during our summer, but they're actually breeding in New Zealand and Australia during our winter. And so there's about 63,000 locations. You'll see that some of the locations are going to jump across the land, but that's just kind of a part of the geolocator as they analyze it and try to quantify it. But you'll see that the different colors are the different years. So 2008 on the right and deep orange, all the way up to kind of a rich, what is that, a pink for 2020. So again, these are different groups collated over the years, but since 2008 to 2019. So right now, this is October, and you see they're starting to make their way north, October our time, and they're going to start moving around. So this is October. Birds are coming back south, congregating on the south side of Australia. This is November now. They're moving around, they're foraging, their breeding location being on the south eastern part of Australia. They're foraging, they're raising their young. They only raise 1 young per year. So now this is January. They're still raising their young, and their young will be in the nest for about 60 to 70 days. And they're in a burrow, they're a burrow nester. And now you see February, you see some birds moving, probably maybe not still breeding, moving to the south of Africa. I mean, I've watched this and, drank a cup of coffee and just kind of get mesmerized by it, but south of Africa, along the Antarctic shelf. So now it's April, and they start making their way back to the north, still along the shelf, but making their way to the north. You've got some in the Gulf of Alaska. They're stopping off at the Yellow Sea, China, China, North Korea, South Korea, into the Gulf of Alaska. June, they are congregating, and they're starting to make their way further north, but they're still just kind of out south of the Aleutians. And now you see them, they start making their way. So now it's July into August. Now they're making their way up into the Bering Strait region, your neck of the woods. And again, you see that they're crossing land, but they're not really flying over land. And then now it's September, start making their way back south, and that was the 1 year. So it's really neat to see. And as I said, I've watched this animation a few times, and it's just cool. And yeah, thanks to the birds that are wearing these geolocators, and many thanks to Phillip Island Nature Reserve. So, but what you see is that it's a shared resource. There's actually about 30 million, maybe even 40 million shearwaters that come up and share our resources, because the ocean of Alaska is so rich in its resources. And so changes in distribution. This is a heat map. This is from Kathy Kulitz, Dan Cushing, and Liz Labunsky. Again, the polygons are showing. So the warmer or darker the temperature, the darker the color, that's an increase. And this is a comparison between 2017 and 2019 compared to 2007 and 2016. So the changes in distribution, the short term, basically, you see this shift northward, and it begins around 2014. You've got an increase in shearwaters into northern waters starting around 2014 in particular, and then a decrease in the southern Bering Sea, or the northern Bering Sea, but into the northern Chukchi. How am I doing on time? I guess I'm doing all right. So some seabirds, some seabirds, as I'm saying, changes in abundance and distribution. So you've got the murres, puffins, merlets, and guillemots. These are the diving piscivores. These are the ones that are consuming fish. And so 2007, if you look on the left side at this figure, 2007 to 2019, and then mean density is on the other axis. You see that in 2014, there's quite a shift from the number of mean density starting in 2014 and decreasing after 2014. And in comparison, for the northern Bering Sea, for diving planktivores, the auklets that are eating plankton, you see an increase from 2014. So they appear to be moving further north into the Bering Sea, whereas before 2007 to 2014. So the densities indicate that there's a loss of common murres and an increase in auklets. But the distribution of thick-billed murres is a little bit different. But rather than going into the Chukchi after breeding, the auklets are remaining in the northern Bering. So this is some great, very interesting stuff that Kathy and Dan and Liz have been working on. And so monthly mean, so the wind and surface sea temperatures in July 2016 and 2018 indicate a potential eviction of Alaskan coastal waters into the vicinity of St. Lawrence Island. And so during the heat wave, auklets didn't show up at colonies, or they actually failed to breed. And so that's some of the work that I think Alexis Will is presented on, and then Mark Romano as well. And so these 8 panels here show that the conditional effects of the covariate of water temperature on species abundance. So positive values above the red line indicate an increase in abundance, and then the line below 0 indicates a decrease in abundance with corresponding values of temperature, which is the x-axis. And then plankton-eating birds, the top row, omnivorous seabird, fish-eating birds on the bottom row. So, and in the case of the northern fulmar, you see that there's kind of a linear relationship with that. So, and again, much of this I'm borrowing from other people and just trying to share what I've learned from them, smarter, taller, better looking than myself. So, but again, the planktivores on the top, and then the piscivorous, the fish eaters, are the omnivores on the bottom there. And so what about the fish? I think many people are very familiar that the sea ice has been decreasing. So this figure here, 2013, the panels all the way to 2018. showing that in 2018, there was a lack of the same level of sea ice. So no sea ice, there was a decrease in the cold pool, almost to the point of no cold pool. And that cold pool, if you're not familiar, it's about a 2°C body of water, a curtain of water that typically has kept more warm water fishes further south. And those warm water fishes specifically being Pacific cod and walleye pollock. And so you see in 2018, with that lack of sea ice, lack of a cold pool, that there was an increase and a loss of that thermal barrier, and then an increase in these commercially harvested fish like the walleye pollock and Pacific cod. And so here you see, historically, the panel on the left side, A is kind of the historical. Green is the Arctic cod, aged zeros. Those are, the young, and then with warming in B, and this is from Levine and de Robertis, warming is the B. So you see an increase in pollock, both adults and then age class 0 pollock, and then the warming plus the transport with warm water coming up through the Bering Strait region, an increase in both the adults and juvenile pollock, and then you see the Arctic cod having to go further north. So both changes in the abundance and the distribution. So, and the question here is this the heat wave of 2018? Is this really the new normal? So changes in the community, there is evidence that the impact of warm conditions on the seabirds has been detrimental. This is a cluster analysis essentially done by, again, Kathy, Dan, and Liz. Cluster 1 is the short-tailed shearwaters, that's in blue. Cluster 2, thick-billed murres, that's in lavender. Cluster 3, that's the burnt sienna, if you will. That's the least auklets. Those are the burnt sienna and green. Those are least encrested auklets. But what you see here, comparing 2007 to 2016, 2007 to 2016, 2017 to 2019, comparing that, and this is during the marine heat wave in the Bering Strait region. You see this contraction of crested auklets, and then thick-billed murres as well, and then least auklets. So they're kind of contracting in their range and distribution. And then you see an expansion in the blue of shearwaters. And then those low density communities, that's kind of the hodgepodge, which on the right, it looks more like a mustard yellow, but that's actually the kind of that gray color, but maybe I'm actually colorblind. So, but anyways, contraction of certain species, expansion of other species. And that's, again, during that marine heat wave of 2018, 2019, the contraction of sea ice, or the reduction of marine sea ice there. And so reproductive failure. So to kind of tie it back in, and this is some of the work that we do with NOAA, their ecosystem status reports for the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, trying to use and help inform the fishery harvest and management using seabirds. And so this is based on information from Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, that some of the colonies in 2018 completely failed. They either didn't show up, or when they did show up, they attempted to breed and then they failed. So, and that was, again, kind of following that marine heat wave. So the breeding piscivorous, the fish eating, and also the planktivores were both impacted. So it was broad scale. It was across both those that are eating the plankton as well as those eating fish. And this is based on information from Alexis Will and then Mark Romano as well. And so at Cape Lisburne, so that's further to the north, Cape Lisburne, the murres and kittiwakes have been increasing for several decades. In 2016, the year of the die-off in the Gulf of Alaska, the big big die-off of murres in the Gulf of Alaska. They had the highest counts of kittiwakes and murres ever recorded at Cape Lisburne. And that's the furthest north breeding colony of murres and kittiwakes in Alaska. There was a substantial loss of birds following that, presumably since the 2018 heat wave. And Heather Renner from Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge reported on this at the Pacific Seabird Group 2 weeks ago. But what we thought was maybe 1.5 million birds was actually maybe more likely 3.2 million common murres. So there certainly has been a decline, likely due to a decline in pelagic forage fish, especially in the St. Lawrence area. And that's where kittiwakes like to forage. So this figure here is kind of proposed mechanisms operating in the heat wave. And so if you look on the top there, you see South Bering, North Bering, and then the Chukchi. So warm temperatures of the ocean, decreasing little sea ice, and then no cold pool or no deep cold pool. And so if you move to the right, you see that adult pollock and cod are moving further north into the Bering, migrating further north. And then there's also a high biomass of small zooplankton, the copepods. So the small zooplanktons are increasing. And then higher transport through the Bering Strait into the Chukchi, with that lack of sea ice, that's allowing more water to move further north. And so there's those direct and indirect implications for competition for prey, which include more juvenile fish in the Chukchi, and then few large zooplankton as well. And so the planktivorous seabirds, the auklets, either don't breed or they fail to breed. And they also seem to be staging more in the northern Bering compared to previous years. Again, that's 2007 to 2009, or 2007 to 2016, and then the 2017 to 2019. So for the fish-eating seabirds, they're moving further north. Breeding is continuing, but some are not doing well, poor body condition and die-offs, which I'll get to here shortly. And then shearwaters are going farther north, which requires them to expend more energy. And then they're also in poor body conditions. So we did have a major shearwater die-off in 2019. So this is from Russ Hopcroft, University of Alaska, Fairbanks. I always kind of hate these, but I think they're useful. So what you see is here that you've got the small phytoplankton. And I guess the take-home message from this figure is they're very important. You've got your large phytoplankton, your euphausiids, your copepods. Those two circles, the blue circles, that's actually our seabirds. This is kind of a food web and a modeling effort from Russ and others. But you see that seabirds are, seabirds are typical, a minor part of the food web. And I guess what Kathy has put forward here is, but are they? Where do seabirds fit in, and what roles do they play as a consumer? So in this figure, they're actually quite small, but to us, I think they're quite valuable. And so moving on to the seabird die-offs. So this was a publication. This was from the Arctic Report Card 2022. And what this figure is trying to pull together is that in the previous 40 years, is that they're roughly, and these were numbers that were pulled out of the literature and really not well documented, but the point is the size of the circle, the size of the circle there is indicating that the number or the magnitude of the birds that were actually reported and died. And really the take-home message is that in the last 10 years, we've seen as many, we've received reports, or we've heard of as many that had died in the previous 40 years that we've received in the last 10 years. So there's certainly a sea change in the ocean. And so Alaska die-offs were rather rare prior to 2015. and then all species or all the different trophic levels are being impacted. So the auklets eating the zooplankton, as well as the murres eating the forage fish. There was a big die-off in 2019 of shearwaters, and then the thick-billed murres in Alaska, they have also been impacted, as well as the big die-off. And this was a presentation that Heather Renner gave at the Pacific Seabird Group, where prior to her presentation, it was estimated about 1.5 million murres had died during that marine heat wave in the Gulf of Alaska, 2014 to 2016. Her analysis, and I think she'll be coming out with a publication, but it was closer to 3.2 million birds. And of course, this is a public health concern, especially for coastal communities and subsistence in particular. This map here, this is another figure out of that Arctic report card from NOAA, and it's showing 2017. Size of the circles indicates the magnitude or number of birds. The color is the month or kind of the duration, and then you see the geographic scope showing there. So how far did that die-off range, or how far did the die-off occur? And that's where 2017, 18. So there were fewer reports in 2020 as well as 2022. But we did have some challenges in 2022 in particular due to concerns for people collecting carcasses, and not just anybody's collecting carcasses, but individuals that we're coordinating with collecting carcasses, just with concern for highly pathogenic avian influenza. Also another figure from that Arctic report card. So the 2017 to 2021 total reported is on that top line. So in 2017, about 1,600. In 2021, about 2,200 total over that window of time, the 5 years. A little over 14,000 carcasses had been reported. And I will note or emphasize that by the time a seabird dies and doesn't sink to the bottom of the ocean, makes it to the beach, does not get scavenged, and then somebody driving along on an ATV actually reports it, and then I get a report, thanks to individuals like University of Alaska, UAF, Alaska Sea Grant, where I get that report. So this is a minimum, and emphasizing that this is a minimum number that we have. But what I want to emphasize is that reported cause of death, and this is once we do have a carcass that we can get to the National Wildlife Health Center in Madison, that emaciation was the leading indication of death. There were some that were undetermined, but avian influenza had been only detected in about 4. So again, this is 2017 to 2021. And then saxitoxin, that's associated with harmful algal blooms. And those HABs, that's something that when a bird is emaciated and compromised, we want to make sure that we're examining the bird the carcasses as much as we can for cause of death, and testing for infectious disease, and then learning also quickly about harmful algal blooms. So that lack of sea ice, we're seeing more water moving further north through the Bering Strait. That water could definitely be carrying harmful algal blooms along with it, and the harmful algal blooms being associated with warmer water conditions. But my emphasis here is that, yes, there has been some saxitoxin detected within carcasses, but that was not decided to be the cause of death of those birds. But it is something that we want to keep an eye on. So moving along, so this is from Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. What I want to do, I'm getting towards my last few slides. I always want to try to end on a positive note. So this is from Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. This is their report card from 2022, last summer. They have 8 sites that they are monitoring long-term. And from the left side, you see red-faced cormorants and then glaucous-winged gulls, murres. So those are kind of the primarily fish-eating species. And then as you move to the further to the right, you see the zooplankton eaters or the plankton eaters. So leeches, storm petrels, parakeet auklets, and least auklets. What I want to emphasize is that reproductive success, and this is, they're monitoring index sites at these colonies. So Cape Lisburne on the top, furthest north, St. George, St. Paul, that's in the Bering, Buldir, Iktak, or Iktak, however you pronounce that, apologies. Basically, the more happy faces you see, the better. So they actually did very well in 2022. So that's kind of my positive. And now here's kind of my downside. So there's a lot of concerns for seabirds. There's increased vessel traffic. I think many of you in the Bering Strait region know that there's a lot of shipping going through the Bering Strait. With that increase in walleye, pollock, and Pacific cod, that there's an increase in fishing, more ships spending time further north. There's also the pollution and plastics, and of course the contaminants that are associated with any kind of ship groundings that might happen. And then of course invasive species. And then, as I mentioned, that when birds are compromised because they're starving, they might even be more susceptible to disease. And highly pathogenic avian influenza is one of those that we're trying to keep an eye on with all of our partners. And then, of course, the climate change and the lack of sea ice. So I guess my closing remark would be, remain vigilant. Please continue to report observations of dead and dying seabirds. For the Bering Strait region, GAY is an amazing resource and an amazing partner for Fish and Wildlife Service, and we'll try to do our best. I don't anticipate highly pathogenic avian influenza going away this year. You can hope, but that hope's not a plan. So remain vigilant. And with that, Quiana, thank you for your time. And yeah, that's my email, my contact information if you want to follow up directly with me. Please do. I'm more than happy to respond. So thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Rob. And that was a lot of information. So let me say at this point, we'll do questions now. And while people are thinking about their questions or figuring out how to raise their hand or unblock themselves on the video, which is in the lower left, this is a good time to write in and show Robb Kaler a little love for being a straight science speaker. It is never easy being a public speaker, ever. It doesn't matter how many times you do it, you still feel a little. So I very much appreciate Robb Kaler taking the time to talk to us tonight and give us a whole bunch of, very interesting to get the results of the different bird studies. And yeah, I was doing good with all the happy faces in those eggs. I couldn't see where the Bering Sea was in that chart, but I don't know if you can throw that back on for me personally, but then you ended with all the other things coming our way. And I want to give a shout out to everyone here to stay vigilant, and we will likely see things on the beach that we are unfortunately getting sort of accustomed to seeing, but we still need the reports of dead birds and anything else actually that is coming our way in 2023. And I want to give a big shout out to Kawerik. There is a new subsistence program director, and that is Chuck Manadaluk. And I'll try to put both our names and numbers in there for anybody from this region that's on. So you can call my cell 434-1149, and Chuck Manadaluk at Kawerik will also be answering the call for things of this nature, and which is really great. Brandon Amosic would probably too, but he's hired Chuck to sort of give him a break. And Brandon's very busy these days, sort of being a very big player at Queric. So Chuck's number is 891-2819. All right. So thanks. Thank you for putting that up. I just wanted to see, okay, you had St. George and St. Paul for the Bering Sea. And Chukchi Sea was not. Okay, so that's pretty far south for us, but I appreciate that. And I'm glad to see that breeding seemed to be successful in certain.
Yeah. Cape Lisburne, they put cameras out, but they got knocked over by bears. So.
All right.
Yes. I think they've got a new plan going into 2023, but hopefully they did
Okay.
all right at Cape Lisburne.
All right. So does anyone have any burning questions? Now is your chance. You can either unmute yourself or unvideo yourself or put something in the chat. I was going to ask you, given, I don't know how much you're watching our ice conditions, Rob, but I'm hoping today with the sunshine we had today that there are others that are able to get a good satellite image of what the last storm just did to the ice. But given that we have had seabirds reported in the Strait, both eiders and murres, as well as in the southern Chukchi Sea in February, any thoughts on what we may expect to see, given that all those models seem to indicate that, I don't know the temperature of the water or what is forecasted for us, but any thoughts on what you anticipate, given that the ice is already starting to shatter in the Chukchi Sea so early?
Yeah. Well, and I guess Rick, besides Dan Reed, usually Rick is here, but Rick is kind of looking at what Rick Toman provides. It looks like when we're optimistic that there is ice in your region, but then you get a strong south or north, you get any strong winds, right? And it blows it out. And so not great for, I think, again, marine birds versus seabirds in particular, but the near shore, the eiders and things like that. I did see maybe a tweet from Dan. It looked like there was a Polinia building south of St. Lawrence Island, but maybe that blew out.
There is quite a bit of open water to the north of St. Lawrence Island, and there has been some thin ice to the south. But Rick Toman, just so you know, he is giving us a Strait Science, giving us a winter recap and the best outlook for what lies ahead, March 23rd. So we're looking forward to that. So stay tuned.
Yeah.
Hopefully he'll be able to help. And so maybe my question was premature. I keep thinking we're farther along in the year than we are because the signs are so spring-like.
Yeah.
So you do have a question in the chat. Hang on one sec. And thank you, Strait Science audience. Lots of nice kudos. Question is, do you know if die-offs are happening in the southern hemisphere too? That was probably brought on by that beautiful animated graph of those shearwaters. Wow. So are there die-offs happening in the southern hemisphere?
I will stop sharing my screen if that's okay. Die-offs, not so much, but HPAI, the bird flu, if you will, that there's when I was at the Pacific Seabird Group meeting 2 weeks ago, Peru is reporting die-offs, and I think that's both for their seabirds, and I think it's also in some of their sea lions, I think. So but in terms of Australia and New Zealand, I have not heard anything, but this is something, and I'm also part of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership. And that's where there's an effort right now to kind of make sure that we're tracking and communicating, providing resources and information to site managers. So East Asian Australasian Flyway, for example, has a flyway site network, and just making sure that, and similar to Alaska, there's a language barrier, and just making sure that that information is available. And they have the resources that they need, but and right now I have not heard anything other than, yeah. And I guess the other question would be, what are we hearing from our Russian colleagues? And unfortunately, due to the political situation with the invasion of the Ukraine, we don't have a lot of information from our Russian colleagues. So a lot of our information just stops at the dateline, unfortunately. But from what I've heard, we haven't heard much.
All right, well, thank you. And it is noted that in Peru, so yes, I guess the question answer is yes, there are die-offs going on in the southern hemisphere, maybe not food related, which it sort of sounds like our situation in the northern Bering Sea has been relatively recently, but avian influenza, which we did see here quite a bit last year, and which we should all prepare to see again in this region. You have another question from Marilyn Myers. Nice job, Rob. Has there been any attempts to correlate the number of birds found with the decreased number of birds at colonies where counts are taken, so that estimates of total losses can be made?
Hi, Marilyn. Always good to hear from you. Great to hear that you're still around too.
Hanging
yeah.
in there. Yep. Hi, Rob.
Yeah. Hi, Marilyn. It's always good to run into you. No, not that I know of. Of course, Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, they do what they do, and then I try to coordinate from a migratory bird fish and wildlife service perspective as well. But I guess what I should say is Heather Renner gave a very interesting and exciting presentation at the Pacific Seabird Group meeting 2 weeks ago, where she said, John Pyatt estimated, John Pyatt published a paper with many authors estimating anywhere from 500,000 to 1.4 million dead common murres. Heather kind of revisited that and found that we didn't, let me articulate this. Because some of the seabirds and murres in particular, if they're impacted initially, you might not detect it at the colonies. And that's really how we track their populations. I think many of you all know that. We're working with Alaska Maritime, counting index plots at a colony. But 2015, 2016, they might have looked around at their resources and said, nah, not going to breed this year. And so what Heather did for her presentation, and probably a publication very soon, looked at, let's ignore 2015, 2016, when those birds probably decided, well, we're not going to breed, but looking at and I'm sorry, I still have the Seabird report card up, but kind of looking at, well, now it's 6, 7 years later, and what are we seeing at the colonies? And that's where she said, I think we've got 3.2 million fewer common murres. And the other question is, thick-billed murres and common murres, they're very similar, but thick-billed murres, their population estimates based on these colony counts at the different sites that Alaska Maritime is monitoring, did not indicate such a profound decline in numbers. So the question begs, why are common murres being impacted more than thick-billed murres when we think they're very similar? And maybe it's because thick-billed murres have more of a diverse diet. Maybe they're eating more squid, not just forage fish, compared to common murres. So that's a long answer, but I'm looking at the comment or your question now. But yeah, so that's the effort. Heather Renner and folks at Alaska Maritime are doing a great job trying to look into that exact question. And what they're seeing at the colonies, there was a huge decline in common murres, and that was several years later. And these are long-term long lived, 20 years, don't start breeding until 3 or 4 years of age. And so they might have skipped it in 2014, 15, 16, but what Alaska Maritime is seeing now is that there is a huge decline in common mers, but not seeing that same thing in thick-billed mers. So sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, all good. So I'm just pushing too many buttons at once. So my other question would be, knowing that your management and not research of seabirds is the U.S. Geological Survey. Do you know of any research vessels or research efforts that are coming to the Bering Strait region to do work on seabirds this year? This may be a question that would better be for the USGS, but do you know if anyone's going to be around to? We're anticipating all manner of havoc, maybe ecologically.
At this point with so Kathy Kulitz is retired. Liz Labuncy's kind of following up as best she can, but a lot of the NOAA cruises, the U.S. Coast Guard cruises, often just now save a berth for a seabird observer to come on board. We do, and I can't advocate for lobbying your congressperson. I'm not doing that, but we are in reduced funds. It's been disappointing, just being honest there, but making sure that there are seabird observers on board these vessels, the NOAA vessels, that are doing physical oceanography as well as the tracking, whether it's a mid-water trawl or a bottom trawl, that they're setting regulations for the commercial harvest of fish. But having a seabird observer on board would be wonderful. So any opportunity that we have we're trying to take advantage of that. And at this point, there's almost an expectation, like I said, that they'll save a berth for us. We just have to find travel, salary, of course, and then just get them to the port, whether it's in Nome or Dutch Harbor in Alaska, Kodiak.
So no land-based research really that you're aware of for birds in the Bering Strait region this year?
Well, outside of what Alaska Maritime is doing, I think they're going to go back to Cape Lisburne, Cape Lisburne, St. George, St. Paul, the land-based. And I'd like to be creative and reach out, Coeric perhaps, finding ways to maybe get back to Bluff. Bluff is a large colony outside, I think it's to the west of Gullivan.
Yeah, west of Gullivan, east of Nome. Yep.
Yeah, and so that would be a great idea, but and then Sledge Island as well. But no, unfortunately, the land-based part we're not doing very well on that, I'll be honest.
All right. Well, the people who live in this region, we all depend on the birds one way or another. And I guess it will all be, this is a shout out to all Bering Strait residents. It'll all be upon us to rise up and make sure we're communicating what we see, taking photos of what we see, and communicating what is actually going on. And hopefully, Rob, if we do have any outbreak of avian influenza or any kind of die-off, there'll be communications. We'll be trying to get you the reports. Everyone here will, and we will also, I think it sounds like from the Communication Office of Fish and Wildlife Service, maybe we can hope to get more updates, things like that. So we won't be so blind in the summer. So in some ways, I'm feeling a little better about what is ahead of us, and hopefully we all have a pleasant, happy summer. But
yeah, well, we're fortunate to have you, Gay. Thank you.
Well, there's everyone here in the region. I'm just right on front of the camera right this minute. But
well, I don't think you sleep very much, as far as I can tell.
Not in the summer. Not in the summer, but no one else is anyway. Yeah. Any other questions for Robb Kaler? This would be the time to ask him. And With that, seeing none, I will say thank you all for coming. Next week, next week's Straight Science will be on Thursday, March 9th, and it is going to be about the Arctic Deep Draft Port in Nome. We have Robb Kaler. We have Joy Baker from the city of Nome. She's the port director. She is going to give us information on the scheduling and construction phases and what lies ahead for the residents of Nome as this project moves forward. So stay tuned and tune back in for next Thursday, the evening of the 9th. So that's when we're going to learn more about the nitty-gritty when it comes to what lies ahead for the port and Nome residents. With that, thank you all so much. Thank you again, Rob, for taking the time to give us what you know. We really appreciate that. And we'll see you all next week. Good night, everyone.